Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending Thailand Market Outlook webinar made possible by Stock Exchange Singapore. My name is Jeff from Retail Marketing and Investment Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's a good time now to talk about Thailand, as our neighbor country just formed a new government. And just a few weeks ago, there seems a struggling on the never-ending political crisis here. Now water started coming, so we shall start looking at the good valuable stock and whether this stock is on discount now. That's why we invited Mr. Gerard to tell us. Mr. Gerard is a founder of a CEO of Beanspro, a MAS licensed investment advisory platform, helping Singaporeans to make a better financial decisions. He has then more than 13 years of experience in investment advisory and was previously the head of Singapore Security Research at Credit Suisse. So without further ado, let's invite Mr. Gerard to give us a thought of the Thailand market situation right now. Mr. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and hi everyone. Hope you had your dinner. So what we are going to do tonight is something that is quite interesting. We are going to be just stepping away from where you are at this point in time, whether you're at your dining table, in front of your laptop, and imagine yourself being in Thailand with me for the next 1 hour, as what we want to be doing is to help you understand some of the developments in the market, what has happened in the political scene, how has that actually translated to the company's performance, and then using that to understand how we can think about our investments. Okay, so that is what we'll do over the next 45 minutes or so, and then we'll leave some time in case you have any questions that you want to be asking me about the Thai market. Okay, so this is really today's topic, why invest in Thailand's economy. I hope you are able to see my sharing of the slides. Okay, so I will start with a bit of a disclaimer. Today's session is for education purposes only. It should not be seen to be financial advice in any way, because what we want to be doing today is really to learn and educate ourselves around what is happening in the Thai market. Okay, so what will we go through today? A few key topics.
Sorry, Mr. Gerard.
Yeah.
Sorry, we unable to view your slide.
Unable to view the slides. Hold on. Let me try. Do you see anything now? Are you able to see my slides?
No.
No. Okay, let me try something else.
Will it possible that Mr. Gerard, you just email to me the slide?
Yeah, Juana, let me do that quickly. Okay, I'll send it to you, but in the meantime, I'll keep trying to share and see whether you guys are able to see. Jeff, did you receive my slides?
I'm still waiting.
Okay, I'm still
Mr.
trying as well.
Yeah, maybe Mr. Gerard, maybe you can maybe
I'll
some
just
question for you. What's your view on the political situation in Thailand right now?
Okay, so I think that is really the reason why we're having this discussion today. We have seen some positive developments in the Thai political scene over the past 2 weeks. If you recall, we had the elections in May this year, and then thereafter, there was a period of political uncertainty because the prime minister that they had actually won a significant number of seats in the elections was not actually able to win the support of other people within the parliament. So for a few months, there was actually some degree of uncertainty around who is going to be the next prime minister, when will the government be formed, and when can they actually go on to announce some of the new economic policies. Okay, so the good news is that we have been able to see some of the recent developments, including the appointment of the prime minister, the government being formed across 11 different political parties, which is a positive thing because with that, we have seen the new prime minister actually coming out with his new policy speech this week and actually sharing what he intends to do to be able to boost the economy, and that gives investors a lot more certainty. Okay, that's great. I think I see the slides now. If you can maybe just help to bring it to full screen by going to view and then going to full screen, then I think we can actually go ahead and share some of the slides that we prepared.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah, this the best I
It's
can
okay.
do right now.
Okay, I think we can start with maybe slide number 5 or 6.
This one?
Yep, we can start with this. So a few things that we can discuss today. I think I've already shared some of the things that we are looking out for after the elections. Next, we'll go and discuss how has some of these Thai blue chip companies actually fared. And then last but not least, how you can get exposure to these Thai blue chip companies. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so first and foremost, at the top of everyone's mind, how is the political situation in Thailand like? Okay, we go to the next slide. Okay, so as investors, we are probably looking at how the different stock market indices have performed. So I thought I'll start with a chart around the performance of the Thai stock market. And this chart is very interesting because if you were to look at, say, the US market, as of 31st July, it was up 20% as reflected by the S&P 500 index. NASDAQ up 37% with a lot of the tech stocks actually doing very well. If I look at the STI, not having done too poorly as well, up about 4% year to date. And Hang Seng Index, even with all the concerns about the China market, still up 2% year to date. So the Thai market really stands out in terms of the performance because it's one of the few markets globally that has actually declined so far this year. So your question probably is, why has the stock market been so weak in Thailand? We can go to the next slide. And effectively what you see here is that in terms of the performance of the Thai economy, we saw this very sharp rebound after COVID because of the reopening. That momentum continued into the first quarter of this year. But by the second quarter of this year, we actually started to see a slowdown. Okay, the GDP growth actually slowed down to 1.8% from 2.6% in the first quarter. Okay, what is driving this slowdown in economic growth? So part of the reason is that a lot of the post-reopening bounce has actually subsided. So that has been starting to not have that big an impact on the economy. If you look further as to the recent month's performance, which is the next slide. Okay, so if you look at the consumer sentiment, it actually reached a 3-year high in June. You see this continuous improvement in the consumer sentiment from August last year all the way to June this year. And that is really a reflection of the fact that the consumers were becoming more positive. People are coming back and shopping and actually visiting Thailand once again. But in July, we actually saw a dip. Okay, from 57 in June, it came down to about 55.6 in July this year. Okay, so I think that is one of the factors that actually led to dampen investor optimism about the Thai stock market. So what is driving this weakness in the consumer sentiment from July onwards? If I go to the next slide. Okay, so this was something that we just started the discussion with. Effectively, we saw the Thai elections happening, but for a few months, there was no certainty around who was going to be the prime minister. And it was only until 22nd of August, just about 3 weeks ago, and that we actually saw the Thai government being formed by these 11 political parties and the Thai Prime Minister actually being appointed. So imagine for about 3 months, there was no certainty around who was going to be the next Prime Minister, when he was going to be appointed, and what the government was going to be doing next. So naturally, that had an impact on consumer spending. You're not sure whether there's going to be an economic slowdown, and naturally, you hold back on some of your spending activity. So the good news is that the government has finally been formed. We have a new Thai Prime Minister that's come in. And with that, he has actually shared different policies that he wants to be driving to be able to spur the economic growth. That is the next slide, that I will look at some of the policies that have been suggested in terms of what the government is looking to do. But how do we know that the investors are becoming more positive on the Thai market? The best indication of this is actually reflected in the Thai baht. Okay, so if I compare the Thai baht versus the US dollar, it has consistently weakened over the past few months. But after the appointment of the Thai PM, that is on 22nd of August, we actually saw that there is a bounce in the Thai baht against the US dollar. So investors are going back into the Thai economy again. That is reflected in the strength of the Thai baht versus the US dollar. Next slide. Okay, so to understand what is going to drive the economy going forward, we can have a look at what is the policies that the Thai government could potentially introduce. So number one, there's a target to grow the GDP at 5% per annum. And this is done by boosting income as well as domestic consumption. So a lot of the policies that we see being thrown up are actually aimed at raising the minimum income, or actually to be able to boost the consumer spending of the Thai citizens. Okay, so for example, they want to raise the daily minimum wage to 600 Thai baht by 2027. Okay, next, increase the monthly household income to at least 20,000 Thai baht. Lastly, for those who are graduating with a bachelor's degree, to be able to raise the starting salary to 25,000 Thai baht by 2027. Okay, so a lot of measures that are actually aimed at raising the household income. Next, we also have policies that are targeted at consumer spending. one of the things that caught a lot of people's attention is this handout that was mentioned in the PM speech on Monday. So what is this about? What they want to do is have the one-time handout of 10,000 Thai baht to all Thais that are above 16 years old via a digital wallet. What can Thais actually do with this handout? They can actually spend it within 4 km of their residence over the next 6 months. So it's not something that you can save, it's not something that you can bring overseas and spend, and it is really targeted towards driving the Thai domestic consumption. Last but not least, the Thai tourism sector is a very big part of the economy. So they are looking to revive that as well. And a big part of it is how the visa restrictions for Chinese and Indian tourists can potentially be eased. Okay, so effectively, those are the different kinds of policies that they might potentially introduce and try to pass through in the parliament. Okay, so that is the macro overview and what the new Thai government could potentially do. As a next step, we'll see how this can potentially impact different Thai companies. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so from the top down, what we're going to do next is to see how has this actually affected different Thai companies. There are 3 companies that we're going to talk about today. One is Airports of Thailand, which operates the key airports in Thailand. Next, we have CPO, which effectively would be one of the largest retail companies within Thailand. And last but not least, oil and gas company, PTTEP. So different segments within the Thai economy, and we're going to see how they can potentially be impacted. Okay, so we'll start with Airports of Thailand. So earlier I said that we want to be taking you away from your computer screen, taking you away from your laptop. So now we are going to arrive in the Thai airport, the airport in Bangkok, Suvarnabhumi Airport. And this is an airport that's operated by Airports of Thailand, which trades under the stock code TATD on the Singapore Exchange. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what does Airports of Thailand actually do? Okay, this is something that we shared in the previous webinar, but in case you need a bit of a recap, Airports of Thailand operates 6 key airports within Thailand, and this would be number 1, Suvarnabhumi Airport, number 2, Dom Mueang International Airport, so both of them are in Bangkok, number 3, Phuket International Airport, Chiang Mai International Airport, and it's got airports in Chiang Rai and Hat Yai as well. Okay, so what you see is that it operates 6 of the key airports within Thailand, and with this, it actually accounts for over 80% of Thailand's air traffic. So for the Thai tourism sector, it is very much dependent on Airports of Thailand, given that it operates some of these key airports. Okay, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so how have tourist arrivals actually trended over the past few years? Okay, if we look at the first half of 2023, we saw a continued recovery in the tourist arrival numbers. In the first half of this year alone, we saw 13 million tourist arrivals into Thailand. And that alone would have exceeded all the tourist arrivals into Thailand in 2022. Okay, so very strong recovery that we see in the Thai tourist arrivals. And with that, the Thai authorities are expecting that the total number of tourists will reach 25 million this year. Okay, so the trend towards tourist arrivals actually continuing in the first half of this year. Next slide. Okay, so I was in Bangkok just about 2 weeks ago. So knowing that we're going to do this webinar today, I thought it might be worthwhile to take some pictures to be able to show everyone who has joined us tonight how busy it is at Suvarnabhumi Airport, whether is it at the customs, whether is it at the duty-free shops. What you see is that the traffic is definitely back once again. maybe with the exception of the Chinese tourists, but otherwise you actually see quite a number of people who are at the airport. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is reflected in AOT's traffic as well. So earlier we saw the arrivals in Thailand. I shared with you some of my own personal experience in the Thai airport as well. But we can see that being translated to AOT's traffic. If I look at the first 9 months of its fiscal year, it's actually managed to grow its traffic very significantly from 29 million in the previous fiscal year to 74 million this fiscal year. Okay, so AOT has a fiscal year end September, so the 9 months would effectively be until the quarter ending June this year. So we see the very big bounce in international tourist arrivals, which has helped to boost AOT's traffic. Next slide. Okay, so what we see here would be the numbers. The 2023 numbers are the pink line. Okay, so if you follow me in reading this chart, and the 2022 numbers are reflected in the green line. If you see the pink line, it is significantly higher than the green line, and that reflects the fact that the total tourist arrivals has actually increased very sharply compared to the previous year. Okay, so that's the first takeaway that we have from this chart. The second interesting observation that we have is that if you look at the green line for 2022, it consistently went up. But if you look at the pink line, effectively in 2023, after March this year, it started to taper off a bit. Okay, so while we have seen that strong growth compared to the previous year, we are no longer seeing that very consistent recovery on a month-on-month basis. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is how it is being reflected in AOT's revenue. So if I look at AOT's revenue, a big part of it will come through from this thing called the departure passenger service charges, which are effectively fees that it levies on passengers that are departing from its airport, and that will make up the bulk of its revenue. Okay, so that is what we call a PSC, passenger service charge. And if you look at the chart on the right, it's actually grown very significantly from about 2 billion Thai baht in the 9 months FY22. It is now actually 13 billion Thai baht and representing about 40% of all of AOT's revenue. Okay, so more than 3 times increase, and that is really a reflection of the higher traffic that AOT is seeing at its airport. But outside of this passenger service charge, a lot of the other revenue lines is seeing very strong growth as well. So whether is it, say, the landing and parking charges, which is what it charged to the airlines for landing at the airport, whether is it the concession revenue, which is what it earns from leasing out the space at the airport to duty-free operators, we have seen actually growth across each of these different revenue lines. Okay, so all of that has translated to very strong growth in terms of the revenue of AOT. Next slide. Okay, so this is what we see in the chart. I shared earlier the revenue has recovered strongly, and that has continued into the third quarter of this year. So total revenue of about 20 billion in the first half of the fiscal year, which is the period between September and March. If I look at the quarter ending June, then the revenue in that quarter itself is 13 billion, which once again will be higher compared to what it was even in the previous quarter. If I look at how that's reflected in the profit, AOT's profit in the third quarter of the fiscal year, which once again is the quarter ending June, was about 3 billion Thai baht. And once again, that would have exceeded all the profit that was able to make in the previous 6 months. Okay, so the improvement in traffic, improvement in revenue, translating to higher profit for AOT. So overall, what we see is AOT has benefited from the improvement in air traffic. And what we're going to see next is how has that affected its share price. That is what I show on the next slide. Okay, so first and foremost, we look at the share price of the underlying AOT stock. Okay, so if you look at the share price this year, very range bound. I guess it had that bounce after the announcement of the reopening as China's borders reopen. But this year, we started to see some of the share price coming off because we also saw the tourist arrival numbers starting to taper off. But then more recently, with the appointment of the Thai PM, we saw a bounce in AOT share price once again. Okay, we'll go to the next slide where we are able to see exactly how has that been reflected in the Singapore Depository Receipt. Okay, so that was the one that is listed in Thailand. This is the one that is listed in Singapore and trades in Singapore dollars. Once again, it's been quite range bound so far since its listing. But more significantly, what we see is that over the past few weeks, there's actually been a very significant bounce. And that is really because of the confidence that investors have with the appointment of the Thai Prime Minister. Okay, so really a lot of it is driven by optimism towards the Thai tourism sector and how that can further rebound should there be measures that are targeted towards boosting the industry. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that is airports of Thailand. So having landed at the airport, we are now going to travel around Thailand. And this is something that you see on almost every street, which is a 7-Eleven store. And the next time you see a 7-Eleven store in Thailand, hopefully you'll be able to link it with CPO, which actually operates the 7-Eleven chain in Thailand. Okay, so stock code is TCPD, and that is the Thai Singapore Depository Receipt listed on the SGX. Okay, next slide. Okay, so once again, for those who are not familiar with CPO, effectively it is a consumer company. A big part of its revenue from convenience store, which is labeled as CVS here, that contributes about 40% of its revenue. Outside of convenience stores, it also runs grocery stores, and that is classified as retail in this pie chart and making up about 25% of its revenue. It also has got wholesale stores, and these are larger concept stores, also like your grocery stores, but bigger and selling more things like television sets as well, and representing another 28% of revenue. So all in exposure towards different consumer segments within the Thai market. Next slide. Okay, so earlier we saw that convenience store is a very big part of its revenue. In total, it operates more than 14,000 stores in Thailand. 7,000 of these are franchised, and 7,000 it actually operates by itself. Okay, so total of 14,000 stores. And if we look at the market share, with the 7-Eleven brand in itself, it will have more than 40% market share within all convenience stores in Thailand. If we add in Lotus Go Fresh, which is also another convenience store brand that it operates, then the total market share will be close to 70%. So once again, very dominant within the entire convenience store market in Thailand. Next slide. Okay, so earlier we saw the share price performance of AOT. Next, we are going to look at how CPO has actually performed. Okay, if you look at the revenue profit, it has also gone up in the recent quarter. Revenue up 8.5% year on year to about 232 billion Thai baht. Net profit up about 50% year on year to 4 billion Thai baht. Okay, so we also see the improvement in profit coming through. Next slide. Okay, so what is driving this improvement in revenue? As a consumer company, we wanted to be able to open up more stores, and that's what we see for CPO. In the first half of this year, it opened up about 377 stores, and that will put it on track to opening at least another 700 stores this year, which is what it was able to do consistently over the last few years. So the store opening is pretty much on track, and that has allowed CPO to be able to gain higher revenue. Next slide. Okay, so earlier, if you had joined our previous webinar, you have recalled that I shared that in terms of the daily revenue per store, what we saw in the first quarter of this year was still below where it was in 2019. Fast forward one quarter later, what we see is that with the improvement in consumer spending, with more tourist arrivals in Thailand, the average daily revenue per store is now at about 84,000, and that is above where it was in 2019 prior to COVID. Okay, so that is once again a positive sign that has helped to boost its revenue. Next slide. Okay, so this is what we see in terms of the revenue. The total revenue was about 232 billion Thai baht in the second quarter of this year. And this is above where it was in the second quarter of last year, as well as the first quarter of this year. So really a reflection of the store openings, as a reflection of the higher revenue per store it is able to generate. Next slide. Okay, so once again, this is how it has been reflected in terms of the profit. If you look at the second quarter of this year, profit of about 4 billion Thai baht, I shared earlier that it's close to 50% above where it was in the second quarter of last year. But if I compare to the first quarter of this year, we have seen the incremental improvement in profit as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have seen the improvement in revenue, we have seen the improvement in profit. Has that benefited shareholders? So once again, this is the stock price in Thai baht of the CPO shares that are listed in Thailand. Once again, we saw this very big bounce in the second half of last year with the reopening. In the early part of this year, it started to taper off a bit. But more significantly, if you look at the last 2 weeks, we saw a very big bounce in the share price after the election of the Thai Prime Minister. Okay, if I go on to the next slide, that is reflected in the share price of the Singapore Depository Receipt as well. So from a low of about $2.20, it is now back to above 250, and that is effectively a reflection of how investors are optimistic about the new Thai Prime Minister and what he can do to boost Thai consumer spending. And of course, the hope is that with the handouts, with the boost to income, all of it will drive Thai citizens to actually spend more and actually help CPO derive a higher revenue. Okay, so all in, CPO is a consumer play, and a lot of investors are looking out very closely as to whether the increase in consumer spending with the stimulus package that the Thai government has announced is going to be boosting the share price of CPO. Okay, so that is on the consumer side. Last but not least, I want to be talking about PTTEP on the next slide. Okay, so we have talked about the Thai elections, but a question that a lot of Malaysian, Singapore investors always ask us is, you know, oil price is now back to close to $90 per barrel. How do I get exposure to names that benefit from higher oil prices? Is it the usual oil services companies that are listed in Singapore and Malaysia, or are there other names that we can consider? So PTTEP is one of the largest oil and gas exploration and production companies within Southeast Asia that I wanted to talk a bit more about and share with you guys how it can potentially benefit from higher oil prices. Okay, next slide. Okay, so PTTEP is very simple. You don't have to look at like charter rates of the vessels. You don't have to look at how the oil and gas capex is. Effectively, it just sells two products, oil and gas, and that will make up all of its revenue. and it will be selling this oil and gas products to Thailand, other parts of Southeast Asia, as well as the rest of the world. Next slide. Okay, so why look at PTTEP? Okay, so we saw this very big bounce in oil prices in the last few months. Really a reflection of two things. Number one, some of the concerns around a global recession has actually eased. The US economy is growing stronger than expected. So that has helped to boost the demand for oil. Secondly, on the supply side, we have seen some of the production cuts coming through. Just last week, we saw Saudi Arabia and Russia agreeing to extend the production cuts. So that is actually helping to help the oil prices go back into equilibrium and boosting the oil prices further. Okay. The other key takeaway that I have from this chart is that if I look at the first half of this year, oil prices were lower than what it was in most of 2022. And that is really a reflection of the concerns around global recession, as well as the post-Ukraine crisis boost actually starting to ease. Okay. So that's what we see in terms of the oil price, and we can see that being reflected in PTTEP's earnings as well. Next slide. Okay, so for PTTEP, it's fairly easy to analyze. Effectively, we just have to look at what is the price that's able to sell the oil and gas it is producing, and what is the average cost of production. Okay, so firstly, if we look at the average selling price, in the first half of this year, it was at $48 per barrel of energy, and that is lower than what it was in 2022. If you recall the oil price chart that I shared earlier, really this is a reflection of the lower oil price that we saw in the first half of this year. Okay, so that's not something that PTTEP is able to control, but what it is able to control is the unit cost. And what we see here is that it's actually come down from $28 per barrel of energy in 2022 to $26 in the first half of this year. Okay, so with the difference between the average selling price and the unit cost, PTTEP is still able to make a profit in the first half of this year. Next slide. Okay, so I think for a lot of investors who may be interested in dividend stocks, this is a chart that may be interesting, because if you were to look at PTTEP, it paid out a dividend of 9.25 Thai baht in 2022. That translates to a dividend yield of about 6%. If I look at 2023 in the first half of this year, even though the profit came down slightly, what we actually see is that it maintained the dividend at $4.25 Thai baht in the first half of this year. And if it maintains the full year dividend as well, that means that investors can potentially get a dividend yield of about close to 6%. Okay, so something that is worth noting in terms of how attractive the dividend payout of PTTEP actually is. Next slide. Okay, so this is how PTTEP share price has actually evolved. We have seen that very big bounce in 2022 with the higher oil prices coming down this year in the first half, especially with the weaker oil prices. But once again, in the past few weeks, as oil prices trended up, PTTEP share price has started to bounce as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the share price of PTTEP SDR in Singapore. If you recall what we shared earlier for CPO as well as AOT, the share price has been pretty much range bound with the exception of the bounce in the last few weeks. But for PTTEP, effectively from about 550 back in June, it is now at about $6.16 Sing dollars. So close to a 10% bounce after its listing in May. And that's a reflection of the higher oil price that we have seen. Okay, so probably of interest for investors who are looking to get exposure towards higher oil prices. Okay, so I've given an introduction about AOT, CPO, as well as PTTEP. What are some of the drivers? Next, we'll look at some of the risks relating to these names. Next slide. Okay, so as investors, what should we be mindful about when investing in some of these Thai names? Okay, so first and foremost, we started the discussion with the political landscape. While the government has been formed, I guess what we just need to be aware of is that it may not be so straightforward for them to be able to then pass the policies, because recall the new government comprises of 11 different parties. So that is something that we need them to be able to come into agreement before the policies are passed. Okay. Next, as many of you might be aware, the global growth is actually slowing down because of the very high interest rates in the US. And if the US continues to keep interest rates higher for longer, this means that the US dollar could continue to strengthen against the Thai baht. Okay, next slide. So having looked at the top down, having looked at individual Thai blue chip companies, you're probably wondering, how can we get exposure towards this Thai blue chip names? Okay, so I wanted to introduce you to Singapore Depository Receipts, which are a new product on the SGX. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned these three names earlier: CPO, AOT, as well as PTTEP. I hope you have a better understanding of what they do now. But you can actually trade these three names on the Singapore Exchange now. Okay, so CPO with the stock code TCPD, AOT with the stock code TATD, and PTTEP with the stock code TPED. Okay, so all of them have got Singapore Depository Receipts. They are listed on the SGX. How does it actually work? Okay, that's something I'll explain on the next slide. Okay, so what are these Singapore Depository Receipts? Effectively, they are issued on non-voting depository receipts on shares that are listed on the Stock Exchange of Thailand. So earlier, say we talked about Airports of Thailand. It is a stock that's listed on Thailand Stock Exchange. So there are actually non-voting depository receipts, which are a class of shares on the Stock Exchange of Thailand, and the SDR are actually issued on these MVDRs. So as a buyer of the SDR, you effectively have beneficial interest towards these underlying shares, which are listed in Thailand. Okay, so that is effectively how the SDR work and allow you to gain exposure towards these Thai blue chip names. Next slide. Okay, so why do we look at these SDRs and what are some of the benefits? The first is cost simplification. So in the past, you may have challenges accessing the Thai market, but now effectively, in the same way that you might be able to invest in Singapore stocks, you will also be able to invest in these Thai companies by investing in them on the Singapore Stock Exchange. Okay, so that is the part around the cost simplification. It is convenient as well, because in the same way that you're able to access these Singapore stocks, you're also able to access this Singapore Depository Receipts. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what do you need to know before investing in these SDRs? Number one, there's no formal agreement with the underlying company. So effectively, you will not hear directly from the company in itself. This will be done through the SDR issuer, which is a financial institution in Singapore. And in terms of, say, company announcement, annual report, all of it will be processed by the SDR issuer rather than the underlying company. Okay, number two, you will not have any voting rights because recall they are issued on the non-voting depository receipts, which do not have any voting rights to them. Next, for those who are looking at the dividend payout, you will be eligible for the dividend paid out by the underlying company, just that it will not be paid out to you on the same day that the company is paying out these dividends, because the SDR issuer will have to take this dividend, convert it to Sing dollar, and actually pay out to you as the SDR holder. Last but not least, if you choose to, you can convert the SDR into the underlying stock, because remember, there is an underlying stock that has been issued and will allow you to then convert it if you actually choose to be doing so. Okay, so in a nutshell, that is really what Singapore Depository Receipts are. If you have questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A later. Okay, next slide. Okay, so in summary, we have seen that ASEAN is expected to grow faster than the rest of the world, and the Thai economy is expected to have this boost with the recovery in global travel, and all the more so with the appointment of the Thai Prime Minister, as well as the formation of the new government, expected to provide a further boost towards Thai consumer spending. So what Singapore Depository Receipts do is that they offer you access to these different Thai blue chip companies that we discussed in a low cost as well as convenient way. Okay, so those will be my key takeaways from today's session. And with that, I will end my presentation and open up to Q&A.
Thank you, Gerard. So, guys, if you have any question, please feel free to type in the chat box.
Okay, I see a question about the Thai economy. I don't have the exact number on what is the size of the Thai economy on an absolute basis. But I think what is more important for us as investors is what is changing and what is new, because that is what will affect the share price performance and market performance. So I think if I were to look at the economic growth earlier, we have seen that after COVID, it has been growing at close to 3% per year in 2021 and 2022. And that's really driven by the reopening that we have seen over the last few years. Okay, that growth had tapered off a bit in the second quarter of this year, and that is a reflection of the fact that some of the post-COVID boost has started to ease off. In terms of the projections for the rest of this year and 2024, I think that is the more interesting question, because that is what will affect the share price performance. Okay, so if you look at the projected growth this year, I think if I look at the latest IMF forecast for this year, it's still expected to grow at about 3% per year. And that will put it above a lot of developed economies. I think, for example, if you look at the Singapore economy, this year is just expected to grow at about 1% compared to the previous year. So I think that is why investors are looking at the growth potential of the Thai market. And if the reopening were to take place, the Chinese tourists were to start going back to Thailand, and if some of the measures that the new Thai government wants to pass are actually being realized, then that can provide a further boost towards the economy. Okay, so thanks so much for this question, Dr. Chan. I hope it managed to answer your question. I think that really sets the framework around why we are looking at this Thai blue chip names, because of the exposure that's able to offer us in some of these high growth segments.
Thank you, Gerard. Any more questions from the floor? I guess no other question coming in. So, guys, if anyone have an inquiries and interested to invest in the SDR Thai stock, please contact your advisor or drop us an email. And again, thank you, Gerard, and to all audience. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day and happy investing. See you all at the future event. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks so much for joining, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you.